Be finishing up the China and Korea lecture. We're going to be starting off with the David Vases. So a lot of pottery like this was initially created using the coiling technique. That's where you create a long kind of like rope of clay, and then you are coiling the shapes on top of one another to create the contours of a piece of pottery. This is a fairly standard technique that is used all around the world to create pottery vessels, usually those with radial symmetry. However, throwing techniques using a potter's wheel were also sort of independently developed around the world over the course of several centuries as well. So one of the most notable things about this kind of porcelain pottery is this cobalt blue color. So cobalt blue was created from this pigment called cobalt, which was at this point in time imported from Iran. So keep in mind that this is around the 1300s. At this point in time, the Yuan dynasty, which was the Chinese dynasty that was primarily under Mongol rule, had pretty firmly established the Silk Road in terms of there was a pretty consistent connection between the East and West that was permitting the transmission of ideas and materials across these vast distances. So it was very possible for people in China to get materials from as far west as Iran, or even further west than that. So China actually began mass producing porcelain for export during the Song dynasty. This generated significant revenue and recognition of this kind of art form, and in fact, a lot of other regions actually started to try and replicate the same kind of blue and white pottery motif. So you'll actually see across Eurasia a lot of kind of like regional versions of blue and white pottery. So these particular pieces were made for the altar of a Taoist temple, and they also included an incense burner, which has unfortunately since been lost. There's an inscription on the vases that indicates that they were offerings that were made for the protection and peace of an official and their family, essentially. The inscription is included right here, and it's on both vases. So these vases were actually modeled after bronzes, so cast bronze vases of a similar silhouette and form that had kind of like these incised details on them. What you'll notice when you look at these particular vases is that they use a lot of natural imagery. We have imagery of plants as well as animals, both mythical and actual. One of the connections that was made in some of the readings associated with this piece were these floral motifs with leaves, and there were a lot of associations between these floral motifs and the kinds of designs and motifs that you would see in Islamic pottery and carpets. So it's very plausible that a lot of these kinds of motifs were directly inspired by the kinds of patternings that we would see in Islamic art and architecture as well. One of the most notable inclusions on these particular vases are these dragons, which are kind of twining around the central portion of these vases here. So dragons have a lot of significance in Chinese mythology. They're oftentimes associated with ruling the sky. They combine lots of elements of other animals. For example, we have talons of predatory birds, we have the antlers of a stag, the scales of a snake, and so on. Oftentimes dragons are also associated with creating order in a disorderly world. We also have a symbol of the phoenix towards the neck of the bottle, and then here is a closer up view of the two kind of elephant heads that are providing the handles of this particular vessel right here. There's also a little bit more of a close-up of the floral and plant motifs. Again, you can see a lot of similarities between these kinds of motifs and those that you would see on Islamic carpets and ceramics. So these particular artifacts were created in Jingdezhen City, which is considered the porcelain capital of China. This particular location has been producing porcelain pottery for over 1,700 years, and they literally go from start to finish. A lot of the items that are used to create porcelain pottery are actually sourced directly in Jingdezhen City, including this kind of special porcelain clay, which is oftentimes combined with kaolin. This is also a pretty heavily wooded and forested area. There's lots of pine that grows in this region, and that wood and timber is providing fuel for the kilns. There's also access to a waterway which was used to transport the vessels once they were completed. I have this video that I'm going to link in the comments so that you can watch it in its entirety. It's very entertaining. It's from Chinese YouTube. It's very dramatic. There's lots of sweeping music and like dramatic applications of glaze and so on. Our next work is the army of Emperor Qin Huang. So this was one of several provisions made for Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China on his journey to the next world. So based on what has been currently excavated, there are around 8,000 terracotta warriors, 100 wooden chariots, 2 bronze chariots, and around 30,000 bronze weapons that have been excavated since the discovery of this particular site in the mid-70s. So all of these items are contained within this massive citadel that is actually still being excavated today, almost 50 years later. This citadel contained gardens, tables, jewelry, ornaments, and all sorts of other items that Qin Shi Huang would have needed essentially in his afterlife. So this practice of burying provisions with a powerful person upon their death was quite common at this point in time. There was essentially this belief that when you died, you could carry things with you. This belief is not necessarily unique to ancient China. We also saw similar burial practices in places like ancient Egypt as well. You might recall the Egyptian pyramids and the Valley of the Kings, where oftentimes pharaohs were buried with the items that they had in life. So this is very similar to something that we would have seen in one of those ancient civilizations as well. So there was actually also this complex of underground troughs that contained high levels of mercury, which is this mineral that is associated with life and longevity. It's sometimes referred to as quicksilver. At room temperature, it looks like a very silver kind of like liquid. Unfortunately, it is highly toxic. You don't want to hold it because you can give yourself mercury poisoning. It is actually theorized by a couple of historians that Qin Shi Huang might have died from mercury poisoning. So there's kind of an irony to it being associated with eternal life in that sense. But a lot of these kind of like troughs that were found at the burial complex were made in the shapes of rivers and seas. So it was thought that this was intended to mimic a topography or a landscape inside of this mausoleum to create kind of like a miniature version of the world or the domain that Qin Shi Huang ruled in life. A super interesting thing about the armory of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, all these individual terracotta soldiers, is that they are each different. There's a lot of misconceptions about the terracotta army because they were created in part in this kind of assembly line fashion. That is true that certain parts of these terracotta warriors, like hands and feet, were created using things like molds, but other features, such as the face, were actually hand sculpted piece by piece. And this was very much reflective of the Taoist philosophy of individuality. You can't just make like copies of one soldier and have that be kind of like your army. There's really an emphasis on individuality here. And because these particular statues have been buried for more than 2,000 years, there's obviously been some degree of wear and tear, and each of these statues was actually individually painted as well, but the paint has long since worn away. So these warriors are highly idealized. One of the things about the ancient world that a lot of people don't realize is that people used to be a lot smaller back then. People were much closer on average to a height of around 5 feet rather than 6 feet, particularly men. So these warriors are extremely tall for this time, at around 6 feet tall, and they display a lot of confidence and pride. They have their shoulders rolled back. They have these more stoic expressions. They are standing upright and at attention. They are like perfect idealized warriors, but at the same time, there's enough individuality to kind of create distinctions between these like individual beings here. These Terracotta Warriors are also regarded as a national symbol of China, not only because they are associated with the first emperor of China, Qin Huang, who is credited with unifying the country and standardizing a lot of things like currency and measurements and so on, but because they have been such a significant discovery in terms of archaeology in the 20th century. And in fact, people who have vandalized or stolen artifacts from the site are sometimes executed or severely punished. Here's a couple of other views of a couple of the Terracotta Warriors. I am again including these images to emphasize the individuality of the figures, showing that there's different hairstyles, different facial expressions, even different shapes and sizes of things like ears and noses and facial hair. There's also a couple of more individualized items, including these terracotta horses, all outfitted with riding gear and this massive bronze chariot with an attendant in it. Interestingly, there's a lot of this site that is kept particularly secret by the Chinese government, and not all of it has been excavated yet. There's actually one mound that was excavated, and there's nothing found in it, and it was theorized that this complex was going to be even larger, but then Qin Shi Huang died a little bit earlier than expected, and there was a lot of kind of like political turmoil at the time, so they couldn't quite finish it. There's also an area that is yet to be excavated that is thought to contain the body of Qin Shi Huang. It's been all very secretive and so on, so we're not entirely sure. This is a fabulous video right here that I am again going to include a link to in the comments that talks about the production of the Terracotta Army in terms of the amount of manpower that was involved, as well as kind of like the more logistical organization that was required to create it. Our next artwork in this series is the Longmen Caves. That were created during the Tang Dynasty. So you might notice a couple of similarities between these pieces and a couple of the other ones that we've seen in the past couple of weeks, including the Buddhas from Bamiyan. We have this tradition of these colossal Buddha sculptures being created that is somewhat familiar to us. We have a large Buddha right here. To give you a sense of the scale, this is a scene that I have included right here to show you when this particular site has lots of tourists in it. So you can see a couple of people on the stairs for scale. There's also a couple of images down here of people at the site that will help you envision how large these figures are. So this series of caves and sculptures spans around 1 kilometer of the Yi River. There are over 100,000 Buddha statues. A lot of them are of Buddha himself. There's over 60 stupas, 2,300 caves or niches that have been carved into the wall, and around 2,800 inscriptions that have been found thus far. So this was created when Luoyang was the capital of China from the late Wei to the early Tang dynasties. So there's several inscriptions that show that Empress Zetian, my apologies, was the primary patroness of the Fangxian temple, which is shown at right here, which was constructed during the Tang Dynasty. So Empress Zetian was the only known empress of China. So what you'll notice when you look at a lot of these figures is that a couple of them are more rigid in nature. They are standing and rather static, whereas others are assuming this more contrapposto kind of S-shaped figure. So these figures here are clearly influenced by Hindu art and architecture. We have a Vajrapani or a guardian figure right here, as well as a heavenly king. What you'll notice is that the faces are also quite animated, that is indicating their role as kind of like a more protective and active figure within the sculptural ensemble. We also have the Buddha right here, which is a Vairocana or universal Buddha. He is, of course, the largest figure in this ensemble, and he has this niche carved around his head to show a halo. There's also a couple of monk attendants and bodhisattvas that are surrounding him. The Vairocana Buddha for scale is around 55 feet tall. What's interesting when you look at this sculptural ensemble is that it was very much intended to represent the political situation of the Tang government at this point in time. So I have included this excerpt from the Khan Academy article just because it really well articulates the kind of social structure of the Tang court and how that corresponded to this sculptural ensemble. So we have the Vairocana Buddha representing the primordial Buddha who generates and presides over all the other Buddhas of the infinite universes that form Buddhist cosmology. The idea of the power of one supreme deity over all others is very much represented in Tang government, where you have the emperor at the summit, the largest and most important, surrounded by his officials, intentionally mirroring the political situation. So we have a couple of monks here, and then we have bodhisattvas, which again are kind of like helpers that are enlightened souls that have come back down to the mortal plane to help other people achieve enlightenment. And then we have a heavenly king right here and a Vajrapani or thunderbolt holder here. Excuse me. We're going to be seeing a similar figure to the Vajrapani when we get to Japanese art as well. One of the things that you're going to be noticing in these next couple of artworks is that oftentimes the arrangement of buildings or the arrangement of figures is very much intended to represent a sense of harmony or a sense of order, either at the government scale or even the cosmic scale, or both. So keep that in mind, keep that theme in mind as we continue forward in the curriculum. This is the gold and jade crown from the Shinla dynasty. It is considered a daguan, and it was unearthed from a royal tomb in Gyeongju. So similarly to China's royalty, the Shinla royalty were buried in these lavish kind of tomb mounds, oftentimes with items that signified the status that they enjoyed in life. So there's a lot of different cultural influences in Korea at this time. Prior to the influence of Buddhism, there were a lot of religious practices in Korea that were shamanistic in nature, that were very much carried over from the Scytho-Siberian peoples that lived to the north and the west. So one of those shamanistic practices involved a lot of imagery that was associated with trees. So there's this notion of like a world tree, an axis mundi, like a tree that sits at the center of the universe, that is being emulated here. And you can see these little comma-shaped pieces of jade that are coming off of the tree. These are meant to represent kind of like fruits. Oftentimes they're associated with fertility and abundance. There's also these two antler-like projections that are coming off of the sides of this particular crown right here, and it is thought that these antler-like projections were intended to resemble the antlers of deer and other kind of like four-legged animals that would have occupied this region. So there's also a lot of connections to this idea of a world tree and Mount Meru, where you have this kind of like natural body that is representing the center of the world and the center of the universe. So you can see there's a lot of kind of crossover in terms of like belief systems here. This crown is primarily made of gold, so you can imagine that when an individual was wearing it and going out into the sun, that the sun would have reflected off the surface and made it almost blindingly bright. So there's also this implication of the ruler or the person in power being like a bringer of light, or someone who emits light. So this was something that was very much intended to display the status and power of the individual who was wearing it, and the natural imagery and the precious metals integrated together would have further emphasized that view. I'm just going to give a brief overview of a couple of terms that you will see when we cover our next artwork in the curriculum. One of the things that I wanted to mention, because it is particularly important when we look at artwork from Southeast and Southeast Asia, is the evolution of the stupa to the pagoda. So you might represent this structure right here as the Great Stupa at Sanchi in India. And then we are seeing the modification of this kind of like shorter, rounder hemisphere structure to these taller, thinner structures, and then we eventually get to the pagoda here. So you can see that there's a lot of kind of like structures that are similar. They're just kind of changing shape and size as they are receiving various regional influences and also just over the course of time. So the stupa becomes the pagoda. And remember that the stupa is meant to represent kind of like the body of the Buddha and kind of serve as a reliquary for him. One of the things that you'll notice over time is that there's this development of various tiers. So these levels where you're having this building kind of like have various levels on top of it. So you can see some connections between like the umbrella structure at the top of the stupa at Sanchi and how it's evolving into this, and then we get to this, and then we get to this. Another thing that's going to come up, especially when we cover the Forbidden City and then when we get to Japan, when we cover Night Attack at Sanjo Palace, is courtyard-style architecture. This particular style of architecture becomes particularly popular for wealthy families because it is a kind of architecture that is very insular. It is creating a private space on the inside right here and then basically blocking out the outside world. Oftentimes, the walls that are creating this structure around a courtyard are things like residential buildings and so on. Oftentimes you'll see the courtyard style represented very simply right here where you just have 4 walls and then the interior courtyard. Sometimes you'll see 2 levels where you have an area that's a little bit more public and then an area that's a little bit more private on the inside that's even further insulated from the entrance. This is a little bit more of a detailed diagram to give you a sense of like this area is less private and then this area is more private. So this is the Forbidden City in Beijing. So we again have the use of the pagoda being represented pretty liberally here. Not only do we have pagodas at these kind of turrets that are in the corners and then at the Meridian Gate, but we see the structure of the pagoda referenced pretty frequently in these larger buildings as well. The Forbidden City is a great example of the courtyard style arrangement of architecture, but you're seeing the courtyard style kind of go beyond this simple kind of like 1 courtyard structure or even 2 courtyard structure. We're seeing 4 courtyards just in this one section right here of the Forbidden City. So this is a really large complex. It's difficult to get a sense of how expansive it is unless you've actually been there. My sister went a couple of years ago and she said it seemed to go on forever. It's about 1/4 of a square mile in total area to give you a sense of how large it is. And it's essentially following the courtyard style of architecture, but at a much grander scale. The color themes to take note of here are yellow and red, which were oftentimes associated with the emperor. So this is the largest and most complete Chinese architectural ensemble in existence. There are almost 100 buildings and 9,000 rooms inside of the complex, with walls that are 30 feet high to keep people out and the residents inside. There are 2 kind of main areas of the Forbidden City. We have the outer court right here, which is an area that was more for state ceremonies. It was primarily reserved for men and court officials. And then you have the inner court area. This was the residence of the emperor and his family and where the day-to-day affairs of the state were run. So this Forbidden City was thusly named because only members of the royal court and their servants could enter the city until it became a museum around 100 years ago. So this was the political and ritual center of China for half a millennium and was the center of political power all the way up until China's last emperor, Puyi. So it is open to the public nowadays. It is a museum and it sees several thousand visitors a day. It is one of the most popular tourist destinations in Beijing. You'll notice today that when you go to the Meridian Gate that there's actually a portrait of Mao Tse-tung at the entrance here. So you kind of have this replacement of the emperor at the seat of power to the ruler of essentially the ruler of the Communist Party. So there's this interesting story that was published recently that indicated that this portrait was like touched up in the middle of the night like once a year, and nobody really talks about it, but it's just like miraculously kept nice. So again, this is the entire Forbidden City from like Google satellite view. What you'll notice is that the city is surrounded in a moat right here. So this is further separating the inner sanctum of the city from the rest of the world, essentially. There are 4 turrets, one in each corner here, and these are kind of meant to represent like the 4 corners of the world. So I mentioned previously that there's a lot of significance to architecture in terms of reflecting elements of social and political order. This is another excerpt that I've taken from the Khan Academy article that gives a good description of how these various buildings and the hierarchy of architecture corresponds to hierarchy in the government structure. I also include a too long didn't read down here that essentially says the structure of the Forbidden City reflected an ideal sense of order and hierarchy under the rule of the emperor. The size, structure, and placement of each building dictates its importance and the activities that were supposed to take place within it. So think of it as a microcosm. It is a mini universe where the emperor can have control over every little thing that is happening within this little universe. So a couple of things to focus on for the Forbidden City. This is the front gate or the Meridian Gate, which I mentioned previously. We have this kind of like 2-tiered pagoda style. Red and yellow, again, being primary colors in the palette. So this is the area at the very front entrance. There's also the Hall of Supreme Harmony, or the Taihedian, right here. This was the principal structure of the Forbidden City. This contained the throne room as well as the room for annual festivities, things like the winter solstice and Lunar New Year and so on. So the area that I'm talking about right now is this area right here. This is the entire Forbidden City, and the area that is in red right here is basically indicated in this diagram right here. So here's the Meridian Gate and then the Hall of Supreme Harmony right here. So the Hall of Supreme Harmony is one of the larger buildings in the complex, if not the largest, and is one of the most heavily ornamented and decorated. We also have this additional structure that the AP curriculum wants you to know, and that's called the Palace of Tranquility and Longevity. So this, the name in Chinese literally translates to Peaceful Old Age Palace. So think of it as like a fancy retirement center. This is part of the inner court of the city. This is, again, the private residences and where kind of like the day-to-day executive stuff happens. And this particular part of the city was constructed in the late 1770s for the emperor for his retirement. So basically this was something that was done as a formality. He didn't want to technically rule longer than his grandfather, so he created like a retirement palace so that he could say that his rule had officially ended at a certain point in time. This diagram right here, again, gives you a pretty good idea of the various kind of like nested structures within the Forbidden City. This is only kind of like the bottom right-hand quadrant, but it does give you a sense of like there's a lot of gates, and then they lead to a hall, and then there's these kind of like interior rooms and quadrants. So it's very, very organized. This is also a great video that talks about the Forbidden City that I am, again, going to link in the slides for you.